At exactly 1000 hours, a Ukrainian MiG-29 punched through the front line at Kherson, screaming along at 50 feet above ground level. The target was simple enough. A grain silo the Russians had converted into a drone command center. The pilot had memorized every landmark, every power line, every building along the route, because his navigation system was completely useless at this altitude. But what started as a quiet penetration would transform into one of the most intense aerial combat sequences imaginable. And within seconds, the entire Russian air defense network would wake up, and this single pilot would find himself dodging more missiles than most fighter jockeys see in their entire careers. This is the story of how one aircraft, one pilot, and one precision-guided bomb took on an entire occupied territory. Ukraine had been listening at Russian chatter for weeks. Signals teams tracked Russian chatter across the sector, piecing together the movement of air defense crews and the rhythm of patrols. Once they noticed a sudden concentration of encrypted transmissions around an old grain silo, they knew something important was there. Once they were confident enough about the location, they prepared for a flyby. However, Russians caught wind of this and started preparing even before the jet had taken off from the ground. The pilot was briefed that the Russians were preparing for trouble, which meant the route in would be violent. The first Igla missile came without warning. Russian troops at a checkpoint had been waiting, and the moment they saw the MiG silhouette, they fired. The pilot's SPO-15 Berioza radar warning receiver stayed completely silent because it had a critical flaw. It could only detect radar-guided threats, not infrared missiles. The system was like a smoke detector that couldn't sense actual fire. His only warning was the corkscrew smoke trail rising from the ground as the missile's seeker locked onto his engines. The pilot yanked hard left, then snapped right into the missile's previous path, forcing an overshoot. But 3 more launches followed within 4 seconds from different positions. The Russians were firing without proper lock tones, betting that proximity and volume would get the job done. The pilot threw his MiG into a maximum brake turn, pulling 9 Gs that crushed him into his seat with 9 times his body weight. The human body can only withstand this kind of stress for seconds before consciousness starts to fade. His flight suit inflated automatically, squeezing his legs and abdomen to prevent blood from pooling away from his brain. All 3 missiles overshot because they simply couldn't match the turn radius of a fighter pulling maximum performance. But those launch plumes had just announced his presence to every Russian position within 20 miles. He dove back to 50 feet, threading between power lines at 540 knots ground speed. The radar altimeter showed 50 feet, but actual clearance fluctuated between 20 and 80 feet as the terrain rolled underneath. 1 second of distraction would turn him into wreckage. This style of flying is called nap of Earth, and it's exactly what it sounds like, hugging the surface so tightly that you're essentially taking a nap on the ground at supersonic speeds. The technique breaks radar line of sight every 8 to 10 seconds using natural terrain features. Hills, valleys, and buildings become your shield against detection. Flying along power line corridors guaranteed no surprise obstacles like radio towers, but it also meant rooftop manpads teams could actually look down at him. Each evasive maneuver burned 200 pounds of fuel from his 7,000-pound internal capacity. The math was brutal. 35 more hard turns like the ones he'd just performed, and he'd be walking home. Meanwhile, a P-18 spoon rest radar was picking up intermittent returns despite his low altitude. This Vietnam-era system operates in the VHF band between 150 and 170 megahertz, and those long wavelengths penetrate terrain far better than modern X-band radars. Think of it like hearing the deep bass from your neighbor's music through walls while the higher-pitched vocals get blocked. The Russian operator was starting to recognize a pattern in the fleeting contacts and was already alerting a panzer crew 12 kilometers ahead about the probable route. Air defense crews were alerted across the entire sector, and they quickly hatched up a plan to turn this penetration run into a coordinated trap. As the jet maneuvered through the low terrain, a factory roof Igla forced the pilot up to 200 feet, breaking his low-altitude protection. That short climb broke his low-altitude cover. His SPO-15 threat display lit up immediately as multiple radar systems swept, tracked, and prepared shots from different frequency bands. A Panzer's 1 RS-2E radar cycled between its wide search pattern and its narrow tracking mode as it tried to lock him. He performed a notch maneuver by turning perpendicular to the beam so the radar would lose him in ground clutter, but the deviation added distance and cost precious fuel. Russian crews were building a layered trap. The P-18 VI-HF radar was flushing him out with its terrain-penetrating wavelength, while X-band fire control radars prepared to guide missiles. A Tor M2 system was powering up, and once ready, it could track dozens of targets while firing on several at once. They calculated that he would enter its engagement zone in under 2 minutes. So, their Krasuka 4 jammer activated and flooded the sky with interference that disrupted his GPS. Satellite connections dropped from 8 to 4, pushing his JDAM's accuracy far beyond acceptable limits. Fortunately, Ukrainian engineers had prepared for exactly this. Their modified JDAM-ER carried an upgraded inertial navigation system built around ring laser gyros. Even without GPS, it could stay accurate for a short period by remembering its starting point and calculating every movement since. The pilot ran a diagnostic and watched data flow through the improvised pylon interface. It was a Frankenstein setup, American weapons on a Soviet jet, but it worked. The bomb's GPS table updated, the gyros spun up, and the battery showed more than enough power for the glide. He programmed backup impact settings so the bomb could use barometric and inertial guidance if all satellites were lost. He entered wind speed, temperature, and pressure so the weapon's computer could calculate its glide path precisely. 30 seconds to the initial point, he would have to climb into the kill zone, drop the weapon, and somehow survive the escape. So, when the initial point arrived, he pulled back hard. The MiG shot upward like a rocket, burning speed to gain altitude. The SPO-15 shifted from its searching tone to a solid lock. The Tor M2 had him, but at 15,000 feet and 185 knots, he hit the button and the JDAM dropped, breaking loose with a few fragments. And those fragments were about to change everything. The fragments punched through the port engine compressor section with a sound like a hammer striking a bell. Exhaust gas temperature immediately spiked into the red zone. The pilot throttled back to idle, then shut down the damaged engine completely before it could catch fire. Fire warning lights stayed dark, which was good news, but he just lost half his thrust 40 miles behind enemy lines. The MiG-29 was designed by Soviet engineers who assumed everything would eventually break in combat. Single-engine flight was completely manageable under normal circumstances, but nothing about this situation was normal when every Russian position was actively trying to shoot him down. The MiG screamed over Holopristan at 800 feet, and the entire city erupted in defensive fire. Every Zu-23 anti-aircraft position opened up simultaneously. These twin 23mm autocannons pump out 950 rounds per minute each, and the Russians were using barrage fire technique. Instead of aiming where the plane was, they calculated where it would be and created walls of steel in that space. Every fifth round was a tracer, and they looked exactly like those laser effects from Star Wars movies, except each one represented a projectile bigger than your thumb traveling at twice the speed of sound. The Russians had set up a flak trap, holding their fire until he was committed to his exit route with no maneuvering room. Smart tactical thinking, but the pilot had one advantage. He was flying through his own sonic boom. The overpressure wave from supersonic flight disrupted optical sights, making everything shimmer like a desert mirage. Gunners were trying to aim through constantly distorting air, throwing their shots wide, but within no time, 23mm rounds started connecting with the airframe. The aircraft was becoming progressively harder to control with each hit, and through the chaos, he could see Ukrainian territory ahead, roughly 35 miles distant. The MiG was barely responding to control inputs, but it was still flying because Soviet engineers built these machines like flying tanks. Triple redundancy in every critical system meant he could fly with half the aircraft shot away, and that design philosophy was keeping him alive right now. Behind him, 40 miles back, the JDAM-ER was entering its terminal dive phase, and the drone operators in that grain silo had no idea what was coming. The JDAM plummeted toward the grain silo at 287 meters per second. Russian drone operators inside were coordinating their morning strike packages against Ukrainian positions, completely unaware that a precision-guided bomb was 3 seconds from impact. The weapon's FMU-152 joint programmable fuse was set to delayed mode, meaning it would penetrate deep before detonation. The bomb struck the center support column at over 600 miles per hour, punching through reinforced concrete like tissue paper. It penetrated through 2 more floors of concrete and steel infrastructure before the fuse triggered. Then, 445 pounds of tritonal explosive, 80% TNT mixed with 20% aluminum powder, converted to pure energy in microseconds. The blast over pressure reached 300 psi at 10 meters radius, enough to pulverize concrete and vaporize anything organic. The aluminum powder created a fireball that peaked at 2,800 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt steel instantly. The blast wave traveled through the concrete structure at 1,700 meters per second, faster than a rifle bullet. This created a spalling effect where the concrete itself fragmented into thousands of lethal projectiles moving at supersonic speeds. The entire Russian drone coordination center for this sector had been leveled in less than 7 seconds. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian pilot was nursing his crippled MiG toward friendly airspace. He maintained minimum controllable airspeed on one engine, fighting failing hydraulics with every meter of progress. Control inputs that normally required light finger pressure now demanded his full strength against the stick. Russian gunners were still firing, but their shots grew more sporadic as he approached Ukrainian air defense coverage. Finally, he crossed the front line at 400 feet, still flying on one engine with red warning lights illuminating half his instrument panel. Ground controllers vectored him toward the nearest airfield with emergency equipment standing by. The damaged MiG touched down 18 minutes after crossing back into friendly territory with more than 40 holes in the airframe. The pilot climbed out on shaking legs, knowing he'd just accomplished something remarkable. Behind Russian lines, the drone headquarters was gone, reduced to smoking rubble. The hunters had become the hunted. So, what do you think about this mission? Could you handle flying at 50 feet while dodging missiles from every direction? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and smash that like button if you want more intense combat stories like this. Subscribe to our channel because we've got plenty more incredible tales coming your way. Until next time, stay curious.